I used to teach in Kensington in West London, which is the richest council borough in the whole of the United Kingdom. Some people say the richest local authority in Europe, one of the richest local authorities in the world, a place where, the super rich live, the rich, the very well off, people who have done very well for themselves in life and who see Harrods as their local store, because that's where Harrods is as well. And that's where, at least 70 something, but maybe 100, maybe more people have burned to death unnecessarily over the last few days. And I'm not, when I talk about murder, I'm not talking about any individual. I mean, there may be, as may be the case with a poisoning of the water in Flint, Michigan, there may be individuals who end up being accused of legal culpability in what has led up to this tragedy. But in the end, this is a mass murder which is not the result of any individual person's decisions. For me, it's the result of the austerity mindset which we have allowed to dominate our public discourse increasingly over the last 35 years, and which has changed what government is seen by many people to be all about. I was going to ask you what austerity means to you, and what it means to me is the cumulative effects of austerity down the decades have taken the view of government, which I think most people used to have, which is that the role of government was about maximising public welfare at a minimum, doing everything you could to keep people safe, but doing what you could as well to provide people with the opportunity to have a good quality of life, especially helping the weak, the poor, the disadvantaged, but with a constraint being the available resources. Now, if you're a monetary sovereign government, as we know, those available resources are real resources. They're not financial resources per se. They're people, skills, capital equipment, technology, infrastructure, natural resources, those kinds of things. If you're not a monetary sovereign, for example, if you're a local council, then your resources are financial resources, but your job is still to use those financial resources, or should be, to use those financial resources to the best of your ability to serve the public who live within your administrative area. And somehow it's changed. Somehow the mindset now in Kensington and elsewhere across the UK, and I think across Australia and across the US, is often that your job is somehow to maximise some measure of profitability, as though you're a business, and dealing with people is a constraint. It's not what your job. You're not trying to maximise public welfare. Instead, what you're trying to do is provide the minimum level of public service and public safety people will accept. And of course, the people who are going to lose out the most are going to be the weak, the disengaged, the disenfranchised, the people who lack the opportunity, lack the ability to influence the decisions which politicians and bureaucrats make within this mindset. And where does that lead you? It leads you to a situation where the richest local council in the UK, one of the richest in the world, a council with reserves. I mean, this is not about monetary sovereignty directly as far as Kensington is concerned. Kensington has $500 million in reserves. Kensington and Chelsea Council is not short of money. They have so much money, they pay what you might call a dividend to their taxpayers who pay their taxes in full. They give some of it back. But it's a local council which sells off assets to preferred buyers. They've sold off a valuable piece of local infrastructure, which was a historic library, and in the teeth of opposition from many members of the public, to a private school. It's a council which sees the rich as their real clients. The poor are seen as an inconvenience, people you'd rather go and live elsewhere in the country. In fact, if you are a poor council tenant in Kensington and Chelsea, they will bribe you to go and live somewhere else, where the rich don't have to look at you, where you're seen as a cost centre, where they renovate on the cheap and clad on the cheap using what may be illegal materials, what in the US would be illegal materials. A tower block, a 1970s tower block, not for the benefit of the residents, but to make it look acceptable to the rich people who live round about and for whom that tower block may have been seen as an eyesore. They do it in an unsafe way to save pennies. They choose not to fit a sprinkler system, despite the fact that public inquiries in the past have recommended such systems are inserted and properly maintained, despite the fact that I believe there's been no multiple loss of life from a fire starting inside a building which has had a suitably installed and maintained sprinkler system anywhere. They don't fit suitable fire alarms. They defy the tenants who repeatedly over time have complained about the lack of safety in that building and the incompetence of the privatised management organisation which has been used by Kensington Council since the 1990s as a way of keeping the management of public housing at arm's length. They threaten residents with legal action, and the residents themselves couldn't take legal action because the UK government has cut legal aid so that they lack the financial resources to do it, and we end up with a fire which the residents of the building itself were foretelling last year would be the only way that they would get anything significant done about public safety. And what is this the result of? It's the result of, yes, it's the result of the austerity mindset, and it's austerity literally killing. Yes, unnecessary cuts in spending, as we were saying before we started. That's part of the austerity mindset. The notion that a smaller government, a government that does less, is necessarily something to pursue, but not just to pursue it to a particular point, but to continue to pursue smaller and smaller, less and less responsible government. Perhaps because of what you so often say, that the myth that monetary sovereign governments face a purely financial constraint is pushed and pushed and pushed again. But actually it's also about being in a position to cut taxes, and particularly taxes on the rich. In so many ways, of course, austerity can kill. Austerity keeps people in poverty. It leads people into unhealthy lifestyles which shorten people's lives. Unnecessary unemployment and insecurity drives suicides. We've seen suicide rates in recent years rising in countries like Greece, where austerity has been, in a savage way, forced upon people. And even globally, the austerity mindset and the policies which it causes governments to pursue, and the financial fragility which is built up as a result of the private debt that people go into as a consequence of public austerity, has driven social unrest in many countries. It's driven revolutions, conflicts. It has been one of the drivers of continuing and increasing terrorism in recent years. In the UK, in the 1970s, almost half of all people lived in public housing. Both sets of my grandparents lived in public housing. As a child, I lived in public housing. It wasn't something that you needed to be poor, the poorest of the poor, or an immigrant who was a refugee, or somebody from a disadvantaged minority group to live in. In 1980, almost, you might say, round about then, the beginning of this austerity culture. The newly elected Thatcher government in the UK introduced the right to buy, which was basically a policy to force local authorities to sell off their housing stock on the cheap at discounted rates to establish tenants. And of course that was very popular. Members of my family took it up. You want to make yourself popular with some council tenants, then give them the right to buy their homes on the cheap. But at the same time, they banned local councils from using the money that was raised from selling public housing to reinvest in new public housing. So they shrank the public housing stock over time. And these people that bought this public housing, eventually it was sold to people who became private landlords. So basically it shifted people who were living in rented accommodation from secure and cheap and what should be well-maintained public housing into the private system, and the rights that private tenants had over time were eroded as well. At the same time down the years, and this has become particularly vicious in the last few years in the UK, there were severe cuts in transfers from the monetary sovereign central government to local authorities, justified as what was called a way of dealing with vertical imbalance. Vertical imbalance was the idea that the money came predominantly from the central government, but it was local authorities that were deciding how to spend that money. And what the right argued, and what many on the so-called left went along with, was that this caused local authority to somehow be wasteful in terms of their spending, because they weren't having to raise taxes locally in order to match the spending that they were doing. So the British government between 2016 and 2020 is planning on reducing these transfers from the centre to local authorities by as much as 50% again. Local authorities are supposed to now depend more on local revenue streams. What that means is that in places like Kensington and Chelsea, as I mentioned at the beginning, this has no significant implications at all. They've got plenty of resources. So it's no excuse for what's happened there. That's purely a result of the austerity mindset. But in other parts of the country, in poor local authority areas, it means cuts. It means people who used to get discounts on their council tax because they're in poverty no longer get those discounts. It means it means public services are cut left, right and centre. It means things are privatised. And worst of all, it is a fundamental change in an attitude which used to exist in countries like the UK, which was that the role of central government was to assist in evening up an uneven playing field, limiting the variations in living standards between different parts of the country, between poorer regions and richer regions. And, well, that's basically as much as I can say at the moment. That's how the poverty mindset has taken root in the UK, and maybe it has in the US as well, and to an extent in Australia too. This is the case. It's infected all levels of government, and it's infected the way in which people think about government, not just on the right, but politicians who think of themselves on the centre, even some politicians who describe themselves as being on the centre left. And it's infected the public discourse too, the ordinary person in the street. Now, many of them anyway, at least until now, maybe this will change, but have come to the view that the government is like a household, as you so often say, these myths, they now take as though they're truths that it's almost impossible to get them to think about and to dispute. And the final outcome of all this is a very unequal society, and one where there's a much greater chance of things like the fire at the Grenfell Tower in Westway, that some of your viewers may have seen, by the way, that building. It's just off a road between the west where Heathrow is and central London. If you've flown into Heathrow Airport, if you've approached the runway from the east on your way in, as you've come down, as you've looked out the window at those tall buildings there, those tower blocks, one of those buildings would have been the Westway, where at least 70 odd, maybe a lot more people than that, who didn't deserve to die, who didn't need to die. That building could have been made safe. That building was almost certainly safer before the purely cosmetic cladding was put on the outside of the building last year. That building could have been safer if the local authority had listened to the complaints of the tenants who complained that it was a death trap. Well, look out the window again next time, you might see the remnants of that building until they demolish it. That's where austerity gets us.